There be so much that you don't know.
I couldn't help it. I had to keep going with my Disney theme here as we talk about social justice. I will link the rest of that Pocahontas sing-along video for those of you who can't stand that I stopped it where I did. Okay, so today we are talking about racism, particularly the Catholic Church's response to racism. The United States Catholic Bishops released a letter back in 2018 called Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, a pastoral letter against racism. And this week we are going to be exploring that document, and you will be filling out a form all about it, which is where I think you are accessing this lecture. So let's get started. What is the purpose of this document? First of all, Pope Francis is quoted at the beginning of the document by saying, "The salvation which God has wrought and the Church joyfully proclaims is for everyone. God has found a way to unite himself to every human being in every age." Everyone, without exception. Okay? And so, although we have Christ's victory over sin and death, it's complete. We just celebrated it at Easter. We still live in a world affected by the consequences of sin and death. And so the bishops of the Catholic Church are acknowledging in this letter that there is still a very destructive and persistent form of evil that exists in our nation. And although we have made many promising strides with the civil rights movement and beyond, racism is still a sin that infects our nation. So the purpose of this document was to acknowledge that and then give some thoughtful ways to respond to this crisis. All right, some definitions. What is racism? According to the document, racism is something that arises either consciously or unconsciously, so you don't have to be aware even that it's happening, which is a little tricky, is when a person holds that his or her own race or ethnicity is superior. And if they think their race or ethnicity is superior, they then judge persons of other races or ethnicities as inferior and unworthy of equality or equal regard. So often this, again, conscious or unconscious racism, racist conviction, or attitude, if you will, leads individuals or entire groups to exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity. And that is when it definitely becomes sinful. Racist acts are sinful because they violate justice. Justice is giving everyone what they are due. Okay, so what they are owed simply through their human dignity. And so racist acts reveal a failure to acknowledge human dignity of all people. They fail to acknowledge all people as neighbors that Christ calls us to love in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, what are some of the roots of racism, or how can we trace them? So racism actually can be found in our hearts. And again, sometimes it's placed there unwillingly or unknowingly. Maybe it's because of the way we were raised, or simply we are products of our culture, but that doesn't make it excusable. As such, it can lead to thoughts and actions that we don't even want to recognize as racist. But we need to acknowledge that those thoughts and actions still flow out from prejudice that is rooted in our hearts, again, maybe by no fault of our own, how we were raised, or some sort of cultural attribute that we ascribe to. So again, consciously or subconsciously, anytime we have an attitude of superiority, we can be tempted or even fall into actions that vilify, call people criminals, perceive people as unable to contribute to society or unworthy of society's benefits because of their race or ethnicity. Racism can also become institutional or systemic. And what happens there is when there are societal practices or traditions that are consistently upheld generation after generation that treat certain groups of people unjustly. So, although all sin starts out as personal sin, so one person being a racist, right? But what happens is, as people pass these sins down, sort of, if you will, or these sinful actions or ways of life, it eventually becomes part of the very fabric of society. And so the social structures of injustice and violence are embedded into our very way of life, and therefore it makes us all accomplices in systemic roots of racism, whether we feel like we are actively contributing to that or not. So we need to acknowledge the civil rights movement in our nation. Of course, there were so many positive changes that arose from that movement, civil rights legislation, all of those things. But some believe that because of those awesome movements, racism no longer exists in our society, or at least it exists in a very minor way. Maybe some people think that it's only now found in the hearts of a few individuals who we can just write off because they're ignorant or uneducated or unenlightened. Unfortunately, that's not the truth. Racism still profoundly affects our culture, and it has no place in the heart of a Christian. This evil causes great harm to its victims. It corrupts the souls of those who harbor racist or prejudicial thoughts. So, not only does it harm its victims, but those who are active in racial prejudices are also at risk because they're harming their very souls through those thoughts and actions. Because people are still being harmed by this sin, action is absolutely still needed. The action that the church in the United States, the bishops of the United States, suggest is twofold. First, conversion. Secondly, justice. What is needed is a genuine conversion of heart, a conversion that will cause us to change our ways, to change our actions. So we must reform ourselves individually, and then just like sin started as individual and then went into society, same thing with the reform. If we reform ourselves from within, then our institutions and our society will be reformed from within as well. Conversion, of course, is a long road for every individual, and probably an even longer road at the national level. To fully realize the promise of liberty, equality, and justice for all, tenets of our nation, is even more challenging than changing individual hearts. However, there is hope, because in Christ we can find the strength and grace necessary to make that journey both individually and as a culture. All right, the second part is to do justice. In order to do justice, again, justice means giving to those what they are due because of their human dignity. It requires an honest acknowledgement of when we've failed individually and when we failed as a nation. And then after acknowledging those things and making amends for that, we go about the business of restoring right relationship between people with others, with those that we've harmed historically and those that we've harmed right now in our present. It requires a determined effort, and it also requires humility. It asks each of us to, admit that we need God's help. We need grace to overcome this grave sin and to get rid of the scourge of racism in our own hearts and in our nation. So I mentioned already that this personal sin of racism, like many personal sins, when repeated and embedded in society, it can become systemic. So let's take a look what that means a little bit more. Part of the reason why racism still is festering in our nation is because there's been a very limited formal acknowledgement of the harm done to so many. There's been no like national moment of atonement, no national process of reconciliation. And so a lot of those wounds are still open, unfortunately, from all of the harm that has been caused through racial practices in our nation through the generations. And all too often, we want to just push that part of our history aside, oh yeah, slavery, it's a thing of the past. Oh yeah, segregation, it's a thing of the past, and just set it aside and act like because those particular racist practices don't exist anymore, that this isn't an issue that, need bother us right now. And that's the wrong attitude. We need to acknowledge those things over and over, atone for those things, and then also change the things that still exist. Many of our institutions still harbor prejudice. Many of our laws still sanction practices that deny justice and equal access to certain groups of people. That's systemic racism. God demands more from us as Christians. We cannot look upon the progress against racism in recent decades and conclude that our current situation meets the standard of justice. No, God demands what is right and just. We hear that in the Mass. And so we can't just let the past progress be where we stop. We can't be stagnant. We have to keep moving forward and keep making changes continually in our nation until it's completely eradicated. Racism is a life issue. We talked about this a little bit when I was talking about abortion and how it's so disproportionate as far as the amount of people of color that are aborted. So we have to look at racism as an issue that lines right up with all of the other life issues. It's an injustice and harm that is a direct attack on human life. Our church, we hear over and over talking out against abortion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, the death penalty, and other forms of violence that threaten human life. But these same attacks on human life, we have to also acknowledge, severely affect people of color at a disproportionate rate. People of color are disproportionately affected by poverty, targeted for abortion, have less access to health care, have the greatest numbers on death row, and are most likely to feel pressure to end their lives when they're facing serious illness. This is a disparity that cannot exist. And so again, what do? First, we need to see an interior conversion, and secondly, we need to take action to make our society more just in this area. Another thing we need to do is in order to have this conversion experience, and it's important that we listen, that we're empathetic to the plight of our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so as Christians, we are called to listen and know the stories of our brothers and sisters. We must, then create opportunities to hear their stories. And we must do so with an open heart. Try and set any prejudice or defensive feelings that might arise in our hearts when we're listening to these stories, and really just listen. These are tragic stories that are deeply imprinted on the lives of our brothers and sisters, and the sooner we can be moved with empathy, the sooner we can, act and promote justice in our homes, in our communities, and in our nation at large. There are so many groups who have been subject to discrimination. The document that we're talking about now lists the Irish, Italians, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Poles, Jews, Chinese, and Japanese. All can attest to having been the target of racial and ethnic prejudice in our country. It's true that many groups are still experiencing prejudice, including rising anti-Semitism, the discrimination that many Hispanics face today, and anti-Muslim sentiment. Especially instructive at this moment, when this was written in 2018, the bishops acknowledged the historical and contemporary or modern experiences of Native Americans and African Americans. And so at the end of your form that you're going to fill out after watching this video lecture, there is a chance to look at 3 different documents, which are really just portions of this larger document that I'm discussing. One is on Native Americans, one is on African Americans, and one is on Hispanic Americans. And so just reading those 3 excerpts from the documents, listening to those stories, and then I have a little reflection question on each of those. Okay, so some practical steps. I sort of talked about this a little bit already, but I think this is a nice list. So the first thing we need to do is acknowledge the sinful deeds and thoughts, again, both personally and as a society, and to ask for forgiveness, individually and collectively. Next, we engage the world and encounter others. That's how we collect their stories. We listen with an empathetic and open heart. And when we can do that, we can look at others maybe for the first time through a lens that's different than how we looked at them before. Our own view of the world is limited, and so the more we hear about other cultures and other experiences, the more our eyes can be opened to the experiences that those others have had, both positive and negative. We need to take concrete action by advocating for equality nationally, locally, and in our own homes. That's a big one, is just making sure that any misconceptions or preconceptions or things that you were raised with, that you don't pass those on to the next generation, that you're not instilling those same prejudices and racist ideologies to your own children. And we need to educate ourselves and evangelize. So again, that's partly collecting stories. It's also looking at history, looking at modern policies, all of that, and then getting the word out to others and pointing people to the problems that exist. Love is the answer. So first of all, again, when we are looking at conversion, we must be honest with ourselves. We should do an examination of conscience like we would before going to confession. We need to ask ourselves questions like, do our attitudes reflect mistrust, impatience, anger, distress, discomfort, or rancor against certain groups, certain ethnicities, certain races? When we begin to separate people in our thoughts for unjust reasons, then we are guilty of the sin of racism. When we start to see some people as them and, ourselves as us, we fail in Christ's call to love. Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind." This is the greatest and first commandment. But what did he say was the second that was like the first? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And this command of love can never just be, well, you do you, right? Like, just, I'm going to live my life and I'm just going to leave you alone. And as long as I don't harm you actively, then we're good. No. This call to love, again, it challenges us. The gospel, if you're doing it right, is going to challenge you. This command of love requires us to make room for others in our hearts. It means that we indeed become our brother's keeper. And it's our responsibility as Christians to look outside of ourselves and to make sure that we are truly making this a land of justice and equality for all. Paint with the colors of the wind, everyone.